Hi, I'm Ken Schenck, and I'm the author of Jesus is Lord, an Introduction to the New Testament. And this video is about some of the last chapters of the book, chapters 51 to 53, which cover Hebrews through Revelation. These are the last books of the New Testament. Well, let's get started. So chapter 51 deals with the book of Hebrews, which I think was a sermon that an author sent ahead of himself, maybe to Rome. We don't know exactly, although of those who hazard a guess, Rome probably has the most support right now. And it is basically a sermon asking them to not give up the race, to keep going, to not give up. They were apparently afraid that they were about to face some kind of suffering, and so the book of Hebrews basically says, don't let that stop you. Keep going to the end. And as we'll see, what's called the faith chapter is actually in the book of Hebrews. Well, chapter 2, I think, gives us the story of salvation in a nutshell. So it quotes Psalm 8, which talks about how God created humanity for glory and honor. But as you may remember from Romans 3:23, all have sinned and are lacking the glory of God. That's how I think that should be translated. Fits very well with Hebrews 2, which basically says humanity was created for glory, but doesn't have glory. And so Jesus comes to troubleshoot the human problem. He becomes human, he partakes of blood and flesh, becomes like us, but he doesn't have sin like we do, and therefore he can boot up to glory. He can actually make humanity do what humanity is supposed to do. That's a great way that Hebrews starts there in chapter 2. Of course, you might know Hebrews for its imagery of Christ as the great high priest. Hebrews is the only book in the New Testament that calls Jesus a priest or a high priest. If we didn't have Hebrews, would we think that? Maybe we would. But Hebrews gives us that. In fact, Hebrews compares Jesus to a number of features of the Old Covenant. Moses, Jesus is greater than Moses. Earthly priests, Jesus is greater than earthly priests. Even angels, and of course, angels were ministers in the Old Covenant. Jesus is better than them, chapter 1 says. And so we find that Jesus is a better priest in a better sanctuary with a better sacrifice. Therefore, we don't need to kill any more bulls and goats anymore. I'm glad. I have no desire to kill goats on any kind of a regular basis. In fact, I have no desire to kill goats at all. Well, so Jesus is the great high priest who has ended the need for a temple, for example. I mentioned the faith chapter. Hebrews 11 is known as the faith chapter of the New Testament, just like 1 Corinthians 13 is the love chapter of the New Testament. It gives us a number of examples of people who kept going. They didn't always see the goal. They didn't always see the promise, but they kept going in faith. And so Hebrews implies to its audience, you can too. Well, read the chapter on Hebrews. Chapter 52 is about what are sometimes called the general letters. They're called general letters because they don't have a specific church like Corinth or Thessalonica in view, but they're written to many, many churches, often over a large region. James was written to Christians everywhere. 1 Peter was written to Christians all over what is modern-day Turkey. 2 Peter was written to Christians everywhere. Jude was written to Christians everywhere. Now, I put 1st, 2nd, 3rd John in here because they're in that chapter, and they're in that part of the New Testament that has James and Peter and John and Jude. But 1st, 2nd, 3rd John actually probably were written to specific churches, as we'll see. But we'll go ahead and cover them here anyway. So James, the book of James is the Proverbs of the New Testament. It's full of all kinds of memory verses, very hard on the rich and on those who accumulate money when they could be helping others. But one of the more memorable statements in James is that faith without works is dead. It's kind of a counterbalance to Paul's faith is what justifies us. But James says if works aren't there too, I mean, what good is your faith? The demons have faith, but if it doesn't show anything in your life, then what does it matter? James also has that great chapter on controlling the tongue in chapter 3. 1 Peter, be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. That's the old be able to defend your faith kind of verse. It's really about witnessing in a time of suffering. 1 Peter is all about a time of suffering and was written at a time when the church was suffering. And 1 Peter is really a defensive strategy. It's a incoming, hunker down. It's kind of 1 Peter says, be very good people in your context because judgment is beginning and it's going to be a time of suffering. This is not, I think, for every situation, but 1 Peter is written especially for situations where Christians are being persecuted. And it basically says, are you slaves with unjust masters? Well, this is going to all be over soon. You know, are you a wife with an unbelieving husband? Well, this is all going to be over soon. Basically, be as good and respectable a person as you are in that context, and God will vindicate you on the day that he comes. 2 Peter is where we get the statement that the world will end with fire in chapter 3 of 2 Peter. 2 Peter talks about how there will be some who will eventually scoff about, why hasn't Jesus come back yet? And this is where we find that verse, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. Basically, well, it's only been 2 days since Jesus went to heaven, so what are you complaining about? 2 Peter also has a lot about false teachers in it, as we'll mention in a second. So 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. 1st John, I think, is again, maybe a sermon, maybe to Ephesus, or at least written to a church somewhere. This church had undergone a split, and some people had left, some people called Gnostics. Read the chapter. And so 1st John is kind of licking their wounds of a post-split. And it's here that we find 1 John 4, 7, and 8, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loves is born of God and knows God. The one who doesn't know God, because God is love. And 1 John talks about how if you're able to help people and you don't, you know, you're basically a murderer. Pretty strong language. 2 John's probably written to the same maybe the same location, maybe the same church, has much of the same content. It's only one chapter, very short. 3rd John is the shortest book in the Bible, written to a guy named Gaius. Apparently John, and of course I'm saying John, we don't know for sure who the author was, but John is sending a traveling minister Gaius' way and encourages Gaius to receive him. Finally, we have Jude, who's the brother of Jesus. James was the brother of Jesus, and Jude was the brother of Jesus, half-brother. Jude is about false teaching. It's very similar to 2 John 2 and Jude have much of the same content. So most experts think that 2 Peter may have borrowed from Jude to get the list of kinds of false teachers. Jude also quotes 1 Enoch. It's a book that's not in our Old Testament, but it is in the Ethiopic Old Testament, the Ethiopian Church's Old Testament. I'm actually glad it's not in our Old Testament, but the book of Jude quotes it. Okay. And finally, we get to the book of Revelation, chapter 53. So Revelation partakes of 3 genres. It's a letter to 7 churches that actually existed in Asia. It's a prophecy. Have you ever read those verses at the end of Revelation that says, don't take words out of the book, the scroll of this prophecy, the book of this prophecy? Let's talk about the book of Revelation. It's a prophecy. It's also an apocalypse. Now, an apocalypse is not a kind of writing that we really have. In an apocalypse, a heavenly figure comes and reveals things that are about to happen to somebody who's important and spiritual on the ground. Basically, the bottom line of the book of Revelation is that God wins. That's what we need to know, especially from the book of Revelation, that no matter how things may look now, no matter how hard things may be now, God's going to win in the end. Well, there's probably imagery both of John's day and the end of time in the book of Revelation. It's kind of hard to know how to sort it out, and the book tells you 4 different positions on the prophecy in the book of Revelation that probably will show up on a quiz one day. You'd expect it to. But there are some who think that most of Revelation is about the Roman Empire, and I think there's good reason, and if you read the chapter, you'll see that there's good reason to think that a lot of the imagery of Revelation does have to do with the Roman Empire, especially Revelation 17. But of course, the final judgment hasn't taken place yet, and so there has to be at least some in the book of Revelation that has to do with the end of time. A lot of judgment, a lot of 7 bowls of wrath, 7 trumpets, 7 seals, and every time one of those goes off, lots of bad things happen. Final judgment is in the book of Revelation. And then, of course, there's this curious thing called the millennium, 1,000-year period. Is it symbolic or is it a literal 1,000-year period? There are 3 basic positions on the millennium that you can read about in this chapter. Finally, there's a new heaven and a new earth that the book of Revelation ends with. A new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. So that the eternity in the book of Revelation is on a new earth. It's not in some far-off heaven. It's in a renewed earth. Well, there you have a little bit of these 3 chapters that end up the final books of the New Testament.